In 1932, a Japanese agronomist named Kenji Takamura stood before something that made no sense according to the logic he had learned at university. He worked at an experimental station in the Hokkaido region, where the soil was hard and the winters unforgiving. Part of his job was to catalog discarded seeds, those considered too weak, too old, or that simply failed to germinate within the expected time. One day, almost by accident, he noticed that a specific batch of seeds had been stored alongside fragments of charcoal left over from a controlled burn. Seeds that were supposed to be discarded, seeds that no one expected anything from anymore. But those seeds germinated, and not just germinated. They germinated with a force he could not explain using the parameters he had at hand. The roots were denser. The leaves appeared earlier than expected. The vigor was incompatible with the weak origin of those seeds. Takamura did not sleep well that week. He kept taking notes, questioning, testing. What was in that charcoal that was changing the behavior of the seeds around it? The answer he built over the following years had nothing to do with nutrition. Not about fertilizer, not about some secret mineral. It was about something more subtle, and for that very reason, harder to sell to the science of the time. If you made it this far, you've probably already sensed that something is being held within the simplest processes of nature. And this video is going to show you what Takamura discovered and how you can apply it today, with an element that may have already passed through your hands without you knowing what you were holding. If this kind of content resonates with you, subscribe to the channel now. Let's keep reactivating this knowledge together. Before we go on, I need to tell you something that will change the way you look at every seed you plant from this day forward. Most people believe a seed needs 3 things to germinate: water, temperature, and light. And in a sense that's true, but incomplete. Because there is a 4th dimension to that process, and it happens in the invisible, beneath the soil, even before any sprout appears at the surface. Think of it this way. When you walk through an old-growth forest, the soil feels alive even where nothing is cultivated. It's soft, dark, full of scent. You step on it and feel like you're stepping on something that breathes. Now think about the compacted soil of many urban gardens, or land that has been treated with the same products for decades. Dry, dense, almost inert when wet. Seeds that fall into those 2 soils are going to have completely different experiences. Not because the water falling on them is different, but because the biological environment receiving them is another one entirely. Takamura spent years investigating exactly that difference, and what he kept discovering was that charcoal does not nourish the plant. It does something that comes before that. It prepares the environment where germination is going to happen, and it does so in a way that no synthetic product of the time could imitate. There is a complete guide bringing together this method and other soil preparation systems we have organized here on the channel. You'll find it in the description of this video and also in the pinned comment just below. It pulls everything together in a practical way, with the step-by-step explained, and it's free for everyone who is part of this community. Take a look when you finish the video. But first, stay here, because what comes next is going to make a lot of sense. To understand what charcoal does to the soil, you first need to change the way you see germination. A seed is not simply a package with a tiny plant inside waiting for water to open up. It is, in fact, an organism that uses chemical and biological signals to decide whether the moment to germinate is safe or not. That might sound like an exaggeration, but it makes complete evolutionary sense. A seed that germinated under any condition at the first drop of water would not survive a quick rain followed by drought. It waits. It senses. It only opens when it perceives that the surrounding environment has the conditions to sustain what is about to be born. And how does it perceive that? Through the composition of the surrounding soil, the presence of certain microorganisms, the stability of moisture, the absence of substances signaling danger. All of this communicates to the seed that the moment has arrived. It is a chemical language. It is a conversation between the seed and the soil. The problem is that impoverished soils, treated with pesticides or simply compacted over time, have very little to say in that conversation. They are silent soils, and seeds placed in silent soils tend to hesitate. They germinate slowly, irregularly, or simply do not germinate at all. What Takamura was observing, without yet having a name for it, was that charcoal gave the soil its voice back. Here is the logic he was building. Charcoal, when crushed into small particles, has an extremely porous internal structure. If you could magnify a fragment of charcoal and enter it, as if walking into a cave, you would find a labyrinth of microscopic tunnels, tiny chambers, invisible galleries. Every gram of charcoal has an internal surface area that, if you could stretch it out flat, would reach hundreds of square meters. It is an entire city hidden inside a single grain, and that structure does three fundamental things at the same time. First, it acts as a selective sponge. Substances that harm seeds, excess heavy metals, residues from previous treatments, compounds that inhibit germination, become trapped in the inner walls of the charcoal. The soil around those particles becomes chemically cleaner, not because the charcoal destroyed those substances, but because it removed them from active circulation. Second, the porous structure regulates moisture in a way that ordinary soil cannot. During periods of excess water, the charcoal absorbs and retains. When the soil begins to dry out, it releases that moisture back slowly and steadily. For a seed in the process of germinating, that stability is like sleeping on a good mattress instead of the hard floor. Technically, both work, but the quality of the result is something else entirely. Third, and this was the point that most intrigued Takamura, the internal surface of the charcoal becomes an ideal habitat for beneficial bacteria. Microorganisms that live in the soil and assist in the early stages of root development find in charcoal a protected place to multiply, protected from drought, from compaction, from abrupt temperature cycles. A stable colony of microorganisms around a seed is exactly the kind of signal it needs to decide that the moment to germinate has arrived. Charcoal, therefore, does not feed. It organizes. It creates an order in the environment that the seed interprets as safety. Takamura published some observations, but his research remained confined to regional journals. And in the following decades, as industrial agriculture began to consolidate, this kind of approach was gradually set aside, not because it was proven wrong, but because there was no patented product to sell. Now comes the part you've been waiting for: how to apply it. The process is simple, and you are going to need very little. The first ingredient is pure charcoal, not barbecue charcoal treated with chemical products, not industrial briquettes. Pure charcoal, the kind that comes from wood without additives. You can find it at agricultural supply stores, at natural products markets, or you can produce it yourself on a small artisanal scale. The second ingredient is your seeds. That's it. Take the charcoal fragments and crush them until you get a fine powder or very small particles. You can use a hammer on a sturdy cloth, a mortar and pestle if you have one, or any object that breaks the pieces without creating an impossible dust to handle. The ideal size is particles between 1 and 3 millimeters, not absolute powder, but not large chunks either. Think of the grain size of coarse sand. With the crushed charcoal ready, place your seeds in a bowl or any container. For each handful of seeds, add approximately 1 tablespoon of charcoal. Mix well until most of the seeds are in contact with the particles. You will see the seeds become slightly darkened by the dust. That is expected and causes no harm whatsoever. If you want to amplify the effect, you can lightly moisten the seeds before mixing them with the charcoal. This increases the adhesion of the particles to the seed coat, creating an even more concentrated microenvironment right at the initial point of contact with the soil. After mixing, plant normally in the substrate of your choice at the appropriate depth for each type of seed. Nothing else changes in your routine. Watering stays the same. Planting depth stays the same. What changed is in the invisible environment around each seed. One important note: the more impoverished or compacted your soil is, the more noticeable the difference will be. Soils already rich in organic matter, and microorganisms will show smaller results, because the charcoal will be complementing something that is already working. Degraded, depleted soils that have been treated with excessive products are where charcoal shows what it can truly do. The first weeks after planting with charcoal are the quietest. Nothing that happens is visible. If you dig up the soil a week later, you will see the seeds exactly where you placed them, perhaps slightly swollen, with the charcoal particles around them forming that micro-territory that Takamura first observed decades ago. There is nothing spectacular to see, and that is exactly the point. The work is happening where you cannot look. Around the second week, under normal temperature and irrigation conditions, emergence begins. And here you may notice the first difference. The seedlings tend to appear more uniformly. In conventional plantings, it is common to see some seeds germinating earlier, others later, and some that simply do not germinate at all. With the charcoal treatment, that uniformity tends to be greater, a sign that the environment around the seeds was more stable from the very beginning. In the weeks that follow, as the roots begin to deepen, something interesting happens. The roots tend to explore the soil more actively when charcoal particles are present, not because the charcoal attracts them, but because the environment around them is chemically more receptive. Roots that encounter resistance or inhibiting substances tend to shrink back, to grow in spirals, to seek shallow lateral paths. Roots that find a stable environment rich in beneficial microorganisms go down, and deep roots change everything. That, if you follow the channel, is where the conversation gets most interesting. Comment below what you have already planted and what your biggest germination challenge has been. We learn a great deal reading those comments. And if you are not yet subscribed, do it now, because in the next videos we are going to keep following this investigation into what soil can do when it receives what it needs. After a month of development, the differences become visible in the above-ground part of the plant. The leaves tend to show a more intense coloration, a darker, more saturated green that indicates a higher concentration of chlorophyll. This is not magic. It is a direct consequence of roots that manage to access nutrients that were present in the soil, but inaccessible due to the lack of adequate biological conditions. The charcoal did not put those nutrients there. They were already there. The charcoal simply reorganized the environment so the plant could reach them. The most revealing test comes during periods of stress, a week of intense heat, a dry spell longer than usual, an abrupt temperature swing. Plants grown in soils with charcoal tend to handle those moments better, because the stabilized moisture around the roots cushions the drought peaks. It does not make them invulnerable, but it gives them more time before the stress becomes real damage. And that time, in practice, can be the difference between losing or saving an entire growing cycle. What Kenji Takamura observed in 1932 was not an agricultural miracle. It was nature doing what it has always done when the environment is in order. Forests do not need industrial seed treatments to regenerate after a fire. The soil left behind after flames, rich in natural charcoal, is exactly the kind of environment that seeds interpret as favorable for starting over. It is not a coincidence. It is the system working the way it always worked, before we tried to simplify it and accelerate it too much. What this method offers you is not a miracle solution. It is a way of reactivating processes that already exist, using an element that nature has been using for millennia. It is understanding that between you and the result you are looking for, there is an invisible intermediary, the microbiological world of the soil, and that working with it is more efficient than ignoring it. You do not need much. A bag of pure charcoal, the seeds you were going to plant anyway, and the willingness to observe what happens when you stop treating the soil as an inert support and start seeing it as a partner. The complete guide with this method and other preparation systems we document here on the channel is in the description and in the pinned comment. Take a look there and keep an eye on the next videos. The investigation continues.